January 3, 2026. While headlines declared the arrest by the United States of Venezuela's president a triumph for democracy, Beijing quietly celebrated a victory 20 years in the making. With the world's largest oil reserves, Venezuela was supposed to be Washington's backyard. But United States sanctions, economic collapse, and a debt of $20 billion tied the country to China. How did removing a dictator deliver Latin America's richest prize straight into Chinese hands? The answer is hidden in the numbers. And what comes next could redraw the map of global power. Oil shaped Venezuela's destiny long before geopolitics turned it into a battleground. Beneath the soil lies a staggering 303 billion barrels of proven reserves, the largest on the planet, dwarfing even Saudi Arabia's. In the closing decades of the 20th century, this black bounty fueled a boom that made Caracas the envy of South America. The city's skyline stretched upward, glass towers gleaming in the tropical sun. Imported cars jammed the highways. Shopping malls overflowed with luxury goods. It was not uncommon for Venezuelan families to fly to Miami for the weekend or spend holidays in Paris, their pockets lined with strong bolivars. The currency was so robust that a shopping trip to Europe felt routine, not extravagant. The numbers told the story. By the 1990s, Venezuela's GDP per capita ranked among the highest in Latin America. Oil revenues underwrote a welfare state and funded ambitious public works. The state oil company, PDVSA, was one of the world's most respected, its engineers courted by global energy giants, its output rivaling that of OPEC's heavyweights. In 1998, production hovered near 3.5 million barrels per day. The country's reserves, mapped and certified by international auditors, promised generations of wealth. Older officials at the Petroleum Ministry recall the era as a time of confidence and pride. They watched as Venezuela joined OPEC, hosted summits, and played a central role in global energy markets. The nation's oil, light and heavy, flowed to refineries from Texas to Rotterdam. Revenues poured in, funding everything from highways to hospitals. The government's ledger brimmed with petrodollars, and the future seemed secure. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to show. The economy's fortunes rose and fell with world oil prices. When prices soared above $100 a barrel, prosperity felt permanent. But even in the boom times, a quiet anxiety lingered. Everything depended on oil, on decisions made in distant trading floors, and on the ability to keep the wells pumping. A single commodity propped up an entire society. The stakes were enormous, so much wealth, so much to lose, all riding on the price of a barrel and the wisdom of those in charge. By the mid-2010s, the foundation beneath Venezuela's oil-fueled prosperity had collapsed with stunning speed. The state oil company, PDVSA, once the pride of Latin America, became a cautionary tale. Production plunged from nearly 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to under 900,000 by 2020, a drop of about 75%. Rusting pipelines and idle rigs dotted the Orinoco Belt, while engineers who once drove the nation's growth lined up for food rations or joined the swelling ranks of migrants heading for Colombia and beyond. The economic unraveling was relentless. In 2018, inflation exploded to nearly 1 million%, according to IMF estimates. The price of coffee could double between sunrise and sunset. By the time a shopper reached the front of a supermarket line, the money in their pocket was often worth half of what it had been that morning. Hospitals ran out of antibiotics. Parents skipped meals so their children could eat. The United Nations counted more than 7 million Venezuelans, 1 in 4 citizens, who fled the country by 2023, making this the largest displacement crisis in the Americas. For Washington, the answer was pressure. In August 2017, the U.S. Treasury issued Executive Order 13,808, freezing PDVSA assets and cutting Venezuela off from American financial markets. Citgo, the crown jewel, PDVSA's U.S.-based subsidiary, was locked out, and billions in oil revenue were suddenly out of reach. The following year, Executive Order 13,850 escalated the squeeze, banning all U.S. persons from doing business with PDVSA and blocking Venezuela's remaining oil exports to the United States. The message was clear: no more dollars, no more credit, no more lifelines. Western banks and lenders followed suit. The IMF and the World Bank refused to provide even emergency loans. European governments closed their doors. Venezuela became a pariah, its economy isolated, its government starved of hard currency. Shelves emptied, social programs withered. With no access to global finance and no buyers for its oil in the West, the country was left dangling, rich in reserves but unable to turn them into food, medicine, or stability. A vacuum this complete never lasts. As U.S. sanctions tightened and the exodus grew, Venezuela's government found itself desperate for a financier who did not care about democracy or human rights, only about barrels and repayment. That void left by the West was the opening China had been waiting for. Chinese state bankers arrived in Caracas in 2007 with a simple offer: billions in cash, repaid not in dollars but in oil. The first oil for loans agreement, signed that year, set the pattern. China Development Bank wired over $4 billion to Venezuela's treasury, with repayment secured by guaranteed daily crude shipments to Chinese refineries. By 2010, Beijing's total lending crossed $20 billion, already more than any other Latin American country had received from China. These were not open-ended handouts. Every tranche of cash came with a contract, and each contract was tied to specific projects or future oil flows. Between 2010 and 2015, Chinese financing touched nearly every corner of Venezuela's infrastructure. 17 major projects rose from the ground: railways stretching through the plains, power plants along the Caroni, telecommunications networks built by Huawei and ZTE, and even a satellite launched into orbit. Each project was funded by Chinese loans, and each repayment was structured through barrels of oil, not cash. Chinese oil companies like CNPC and Sinopec secured stakes in PDVSA joint ventures, locking in rights to heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt. All that work translated into leverage. When U.S. sanctions hit and Western banks retreated, China became the only lender willing to wire money and the only buyer willing to take Venezuela's toxic crude. By 2020, Venezuela owed China more than $20 billion, an exact figure hidden behind layers of state secrecy. More than 60% of Venezuela's oil exports sailed for Chinese ports, often through disguised tanker roads. The result was a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, but now dependent on Beijing for both cash and a market. Every new project and every additional loan tightened the grip. Long before the 2026 crisis, the real power over Venezuela's economy was already shifting east. At 6:15 in the morning on January 3, 2026, U.S. authorities detained Nicolás Maduro at the Caracas airport. The Department of Justice charge sheet ran long, charging drug trafficking, corruption, weapons violations, and partnerships with groups like FARC and the Sinaloa cartel. Headlines across Washington trumpeted a Democratic triumph. But the real impact played out far from the White House. Within hours, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia issued a joint statement condemning the arrest as a violation of regional sovereignty. Latin American diplomats recalled a century of foreign interventions, coups, sanctions, and leaders removed at gunpoint. This time, the backlash was swift and public. China's foreign ministry, in a carefully worded release, called for respect for Venezuela's sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs. The message landed with force across the global south. While American officials celebrated, Beijing's posture was steady and measured, casting itself as the alternative to Western intervention. Policy analysts pointed to the pattern. America acts, China waits, then offers stability on its own terms. The tribute analogy was hard to miss. In ancient times, kingdoms sent gifts to the Chinese emperor in exchange for protection. Today, Venezuela sends oil, and in return receives loans, infrastructure, and a lifeline. No occupation is required, no military bases, just contracts and tankers. The model has played out before. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port is now under a 99-year Chinese lease. Pakistan's corridor, valued at $62 billion, followed a similar trajectory. Djibouti's Chinese-built port became a military base. Zambia's copper mines were effectively swapped for debt relief. Each case follows the same logic. Economic dependence, forged through infrastructure and finance, not force. The pattern now stands exposed. The arrest, meant as a final move, only confirmed for Beijing that its long game works. The question left hanging is this: if this model can be repeated anywhere, who is next? Today, China controls over 60% of Venezuela's oil exports without firing a shot or sending troops. As sanctions isolate, Beijing invests. The new competition is not about ideology, but leverage. The next strategic shift will not be announced in headlines. It will arrive quietly, contract by contract. What do you think?